Sit back and relax and enjoy the show with Big OG. Like, comment, and subscribe.
I have a piece of paper on my wall. It's framed, actually. Looks like something you'd see in a museum, maybe, or a lawyer's office. But it's not a degree. It's not an award. It's a logistics inventory from 1962. And there's one line on it, just one, that the guy with the black marker missed when he was scrubbing the truth out of history. Item 44. Payload 4. Tungsten carbide penetrator. Status: unrecoverable. Embedded in ceiling. That's what it says. Embedded in ceiling. The military, in their own handwriting, admitted that the sky has a roof, and that we left a spear stuck in it. I'm an old man now. I don't sleep much anymore, and when I do, I dream about the sound of glass breaking. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start over. My name is Vance. Back in 1962, I was a tech sergeant in the Air Force. I worked radar, long-range stuff, telemetry, the kind of job where you trust your instruments more than your own eyes, because eyes can lie to you. Instruments just give you numbers, and numbers don't have opinions. I got deployed to this place called Meteorological Outpost 7. Official name. But the guys who actually worked there, we just called it Station 0. It was deep in the Arctic Circle, so far north that compasses basically gave up. We're talking hundreds of miles of pack ice, polar night for months at a time, and the only light coming from the Aurora Borealis, or the floodlights on the perimeter fence. The official story was that we were studying the upper atmosphere, ionospheric research, weather patterns, that kind of thing. But come on, you don't need top-secret clearance to figure out the real reason we were there. We were at the top of the world, sitting directly under the most likely flight path for Soviet missiles. We were the tripwire. The sounding rockets we were launching? Sure, they carried weather instruments. But they were also testing how well we could track incoming warheads through all that electromagnetic interference. Our commanding officer was this guy named Major Harlan. Rigid. By the book. The kind of man who carried the Cold War on his shoulders like it was a physical weight. He rarely slept, and when he did, I swear he slept at attention. He spent most of his time hovering over the encrypted teletype machines, waiting for the message that would tell him the world was ending. He was terrified of the Soviets, sure, but mostly, he was terrified of high command. He reported every little fluctuation in our power grid like he expected to be court-martialed if a single snowflake fell without his permission. But Harlan wasn't the strangest guy at Station 0. That title belonged to Elias. Elias was a civilian, atmospheric physicist. Brilliant, but completely out of his element in the Arctic. He was jumpy, introverted, and he had this habit of looking at you like you were a math problem he couldn't quite solve. And the thing that always rubbed me the wrong way wasn't his personality, it was his focus. We were supposed to be studying the upper atmosphere, right? But half the time I walked past his office, he wasn't looking at weather patterns or telemetry data. He was poring over these old geological files, ice core samples from expeditions in the 1920s and 40s. I asked him about it once. I said, "Elias, what does a bunch of ancient frozen mud have to do with tracking rockets?" He looked at me with these wide, bloodshot eyes and muttered something about finding the baseline. He said he was tracking microscopic layers of silica and glass dust trapped in the ice, trying to figure out how often the sky had fallen in the past. I thought he was losing it. Cabin fever, you know? I brushed it off, but cabin fever was a real thing at Station 0. The isolation did things to men. And it wasn't just the dark and the cold. It was the base itself. From the moment I arrived, there was this hum, this low-frequency vibration bleeding through the walls. You felt it in your teeth before you heard it with your ears. A deep, resonant thrum right at the edge of human hearing. I complained about it my second week. Told the engineering chief it was giving me headaches, bleeding into my radar headsets. He blamed the diesel generators. But I knew better. The frequency was too uniform. Generators fluctuate. They have a rhythm, a heartbeat that shifts under load. This was a flat, unbroken drone. It felt less like a machine and more like a physical pressure pressing down on the entire base. We just learned to live with it. Swallowed aspirin, turned up our radios. What else were we gonna do? Now, the routine at Station Zero was monotonous, agonizingly monotonous. Right up until the day we launched Payload 1. It was a Tuesday. Late November. The polar night had fully set in, and outside it was about 60 below zero. The wind was howling, shaking the concrete walls of the command center. Inside, the air smelled like ozone, burnt coffee, and nervous sweat. I was strapped into my chair at the primary tracking station, my job being simple: lock onto the rocket the second it cleared the pad, track its ascent, and monitor the telemetry data streaming back from the payload instruments. Harlan was standing behind me, staring at the main plotting board. Elias was pacing near the optical tracking station, waiting to coordinate the high-speed cameras. The rocket was a modified solid-fuel sounding rocket, about 40 feet tall. Target altitude was 85 miles, well into the thermosphere. The countdown crackled through the intercom. 10, 9, 8. I kept my eyes on the primary scope, hands resting on the calibration dials. 3, 2, 1. Ignition. Even buried under 10 feet of concrete and permafrost, we felt the launch. A deep, violent rumble. Dust drifting from the ceiling fixtures. On my screen, a bright, solid return blossomed in the center of the crosshairs. Radar lock confirmed. I called out. Target is tracking. Ascension rate nominal. Keep your eyes on the telemetry, Sergeant, Harlan barked. Not that I needed the reminder. The paper strip charts beside my console began clattering, spitting out long ribbons of data. Passing 20 miles, I reported. Velocity is Mach 3.5. All payload sensors are green. Passing 50 miles. Velocity Mach 4.2. Entering the mesosphere. 60 miles. Velocity Mach 4.8. Payload separation in T-15 seconds. At this altitude, the atmosphere is so thin it's basically a vacuum. A rocket up there is just a bullet traveling through empty space. 70 miles, I said. Velocity Mach 5. Approaching target altitude. And then, at exactly 73 miles above the surface of the Earth, the laws of physics just stopped working. The telemetry strip chart let out this violent, high-pitched mechanical whine as the printing needles slammed across the paper. The radar scope flared with a burst of static. I leaned forward, my face inches from the glass, trying to process the numbers suddenly flooding my console. What's happening, Sergeant? Harlan demanded, stepping up right behind my chair. Did we lose the signal? Did the payload detonate? No, sir, I said, my voice faltering for the first time. Telemetry shows the payload is intact. But velocity has dropped to 0. Harlan scoffed. That's impossible. Check your calibration. A rocket moving at Mach 5 doesn't just stop in a vacuum. I'm looking at the raw data, Major, I insisted, my heart hammering against my ribs. Deceleration was instantaneous. It went from roughly 3,800 miles per hour to zero in less than a millisecond. The G-forces required for that kind of deceleration would have turned solid steel into a compressed pancake. But the instruments inside the nose cone were still alive. "It gets worse, sir," I said, pulling another strip of paper from the acoustic sensor array. My hands were shaking. The payload instruments just registered a massive acoustic shockwave. Harlan grabbed the back of my chair. "An acoustic shockwave? In the thermosphere? There's no air up there. Sound cannot travel in a vacuum." "I know that, sir," I replied. "But the sensors recorded a kinetic impact. A physical dead-stop collision. It's like it hit a wall." The bunker went silent. The only sound was the ambient hum of the bass, which suddenly felt a lot louder than it had 10 minutes ago. We were all staring at the radar screen. The little green dot was hovering exactly 73 miles up, perfectly stationary, defying every known law of orbital mechanics. Before Harlan could order me to run a diagnostic, the heavy steel door to the optical tracking room banged open. Elias stood there. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. His face was completely drained of blood, and he was holding a dripping wet strip of high-speed photographic negative in his trembling hands. "Elias," Harlan snapped. "What the hell is wrong with the telemetry? Did the tracking cameras catch a malfunction?" Elias didn't answer right away. He walked slowly across the room, bypassed Harlan entirely, and slapped the wet negative down onto the illuminated light table next to my radar console. "It wasn't a malfunction," Elias whispered. His voice was so hollow it sent a chill straight down my spine. Harlan marched over to the light table, practically shoving me out of the way. I leaned in beside him. The high-speed camera had tracked the rocket perfectly. The first few frames showed the bright spear of the exhaust plume cutting through the blackness. But the final sequence, the ones taken at the exact moment my radar registered the impact, they made absolutely no sense. The rocket hadn't exploded. But the exhaust plume, that massive trail of superheated gas and fire, had suddenly flattened out. In the photograph, the fire didn't billow outward into the vacuum of space. It spread horizontally, perfectly flat, like water from a high-pressure hose striking a pane of invisible glass. The nose cone of the rocket was pressed flat against nothing. A hard, solid, invisible ceiling in the middle of the empty sky. "My God," Harlan breathed. But his training kicked back in almost immediately, burying his shock under a thick layer of Cold War paranoia. The Soviets, they've put an orbital platform up there. A stealth satellite, some kind of kinetic interceptor. We just rammed a weather rocket straight into a Russian space station. He turned and started barking orders at the communications officer to open a direct encrypted line to Strategic Air Command. He was already drafting the incident report in his head. But as Harlan walked away, Elias leaned down, bracing his hands on the edge of the light table. He looked at me, his face pale in the glow of the fluorescent bulb beneath the glass. "He's wrong, Vance," Elias whispered, his voice trembling so badly I could barely hear him over the hum of the room. He reached out and traced a trembling finger along the flattened edge of the exhaust plume on the negative film. "Look at the impact zone," Elias said, his eyes welling with tears. "Look at the shape of the barrier." I squinted at the film. The fire from the rocket had spread outward for hundreds of yards across the invisible surface, illuminating it for a fraction of a second. It wasn't flat, and it wasn't the jagged, angular hull of a Soviet satellite. The invisible ceiling had a slight, undeniable curve to it. A satellite wouldn't look like that, Elias whispered, his voice cracking with a terror I'd never heard from a grown man. The curvature of that barrier. Vance, it matches the curvature of the Earth. Harlan stared at Elias for a long, heavy moment. For a second, I thought he was going to pull his sidearm. Then the military conditioning took over. The firewall of denial slammed down so hard you could almost hear it. "You're hysterical, Elias," Harlan said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet rasp. "You are a civilian contractor, and you are currently buckling under the stress of an isolated deployment. What you are suggesting is scientifically illiterate, and frankly borderline treasonous if you start spreading that kind of panic among my men." "Major, look at the photograph," Elias pleaded, tapping the glass. "I'm not making this up. The math is right there. A Soviet satellite does not have a surface area large enough to force a lateral thrust deflection of that magnitude." "It's an optical illusion," Harlan snapped, snatching the wet film off the table and rolling it into his fist. "A trick of the light caused by ionized gases in the thermosphere. Or it's a Soviet atmospheric test that deployed a massive reflective balloon to blind our radar. That is the official assessment, and that is what I am reporting to Strategic Air Command." He turned his back on Elias and looked directly at me. "Sergeant Vance, you will scrub that radar sweep from the primary logs. You will classify the telemetry data under a code word, absolute lockdown. As of this moment, Station 0 is at Condition Delta. No personnel are permitted outside the bunker perimeter without my express written authorization. All outbound communications are suspended except for my direct encrypted line to SAC. If anyone asks, Payload 1 experienced a catastrophic second-stage failure and was vaporized. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir," I said, my voice entirely flat. I didn't argue. In the military, when a commanding officer gives you a direct order that contradicts reality, you don't fight it. You execute it, and you document it to save your own skin later. But as Harlan marched out of the radar room, leaving Elias standing there looking like a man who'd just been sentenced to death, I looked back at my primary scope. The bright green blip of the payload was still sitting there, exactly 73 miles up. It wasn't falling. It wasn't drifting. It was pinned against the sky. It stayed on my screen for another 4 hours, mocking me, until the internal batteries finally froze and died. The lockdown fundamentally changed the atmosphere at Station 0. Before the launch, the base was just a boring, freezing hole in the ground. Now, it felt like a tomb. Condition Delta meant the heavy blast doors were sealed tight. We had armed security personnel standing guard in the subterranean corridors, holding M1 carbines and looking entirely confused about who they were supposed to be shooting at. Harlan had them watching the doors, but he wasn't trying to keep the Soviets out. He was keeping us in. The psychological toll began to rot the morale of the 40 men trapped down there. But the worst part wasn't the claustrophobia. It was the hum. Before the launch, it had been a nuisance, something you blamed on the generators. But in the days following the impact, the hum escalated. It didn't get louder in the traditional sense, but the physical pressure of it intensified. It was a relentless, grinding thrum that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and resonate directly inside the bones of your skull. Guys in the barracks started complaining of severe migraines. The medics were handing out aspirin like candy, but it didn't do a damn thing. You could feel the vibration in the handle of your coffee mug. You could see it rippling the surface of the water in the mess hall pitchers. The base mechanic came into the radar bunker one night with a bloody rag pressed to his face. He said his back molars were aching so badly, his gums had started to bleed. I tried to be pragmatic about it. I was a tech sergeant, a man of instruments and logic. During my mid-watches, I ran every diagnostic I could think of. I hooked a spectrum analyzer up to the base's primary electrical grid, looking for a faulty transformer or a grounding issue. The electrical grid was perfectly clean. Then I patched into the external acoustic microphones, the ones we use to monitor wind speed and ice fractures on the surface. When I isolated the audio feed and fed it through an oscilloscope, my blood ran cold. The hum wasn't coming from inside the base. It was coming from above us. The waveform on my screen was a perfectly uniform, unbroken sine wave, a massive structural acoustic resonance, conducting down through the miles of permafrost and into the concrete foundation of our bunker. It was the sound of something unimaginably large vibrating under immense stress. The sky was humming. The barrier we had hit was ringing like a struck bell, and the sound had nowhere to go but down. Elias knew it too. He'd been completely marginalized by Harlan, banished to his subterranean office, and ordered to write up a falsified weather report. But Elias wasn't writing anything. He was spiraling. On the 4th night of the lockdown, Elias slipped past the guard detail and came into the radar room. He looked horrific. His skin was the color of old parchment. He hadn't shaved, and his eyes were sunken deep into his skull. He locked the heavy steel door behind him and walked over to my console, dropping a manila folder onto my keyboard. He ruined the master negative, Elias whispered, his voice erratic and breathless. But he forgot that the optical tracking cameras run a backup silver halide strip for exposure calibration. I spent the last 3 days doing photogrammetry on the secondary frames, enhancing the contrast, measuring the shadow cast by the exhaust flare. I looked around nervously. Elias, you need to let this go. The Major has already reported it as a Soviet intercept. Whatever is up there, it's above our pay grade. There is no Soviet intercept, Vance. Elias hissed, leaning over me. I did the math. I calculated the kinetic force of a solid fuel rocket striking a stationary object at Mach 5. Do you know what happens to a titanium alloy nose cone when it hits a solid steel plate at that speed? It vaporizes. It compresses into a disk of molten slag. He opened the folder and pulled out a grainy, highly magnified photograph. It was a blown-up section of the impact frame, heavily contrasted in stark black and white. Look at the shadow, Elias demanded, pointing a trembling finger at a dark, triangular shape in the center of the flattened fire plume. The nose cone didn't crush flat. It penetrated. It embedded itself into the barrier, like a dart into a hardwood floor. I stared at the photograph. The geometry was undeniable. A portion of the rocket was clearly protruding into whatever invisible ceiling hovered 73 miles above us. What kind of material could withstand that? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. To stop a rocket dead, but allow it to penetrate without shattering? I don't know, Elias said, running a hand through his greasy hair. But it's not metal. It's not any kind of orbital armor. Vance, I went back to the geological files, the ice core samples from the 1940s. I told you about the microscopic glass dust they found trapped in the deep ice. Yeah, I said, feeling a cold dread settling in my stomach. You said it was silica. It's tektites, Elias corrected. Microtektites. The kind of glass spheres that are formed during a massive meteorite impact, when the heat melts the sand and throws it into the atmosphere. Except there are no impact craters anywhere near this sector of the Arctic. The dust is settling uniformly across the entire ice shelf, and it has been for thousands of years. It's shedding, Vance. Every time a micrometeorite hits that barrier from the outside, or every time the aurora gets too intense, the barrier sheds microscopic layers of glass down onto the ice. He grabbed my shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong. It's a dome, Vance. We are living inside a terrarium, and Harlan just shot a bullet into the glass. Before I could process the sheer existential terror of what he was suggesting, the red klaxon mounted on the wall above the radar scopes began to blare. The harsh, pulsing alarm echoed through the concrete bunker, signaling an all-hands briefing in the main command center. Elias flinched like he'd been struck. He snatched the folder off my desk and scrambled out of the room, disappearing back into the labyrinth of the lower levels. I secured my console and made my way to the command hub. The room was packed with the senior staff. Major Harlan stood at the front, beside a large chalkboard. He looked awful. The rigid, immaculate officer I'd met weeks ago was gone. His uniform was rumpled, his eyes bloodshot from a dangerous mix of amphetamines and lack of sleep. "Listen up," Harlan barked over the hum of the base. "I have just concluded a secure transmission with Strategic Air Command. They have reviewed the heavily encrypted telemetry from Payload 1. SAC has confirmed my initial assessment. The Soviets have deployed an illegal, highly classified orbital denial platform directly over our airspace." A murmur of nervous tension rippled through the room. The Cold War paranoia was a comfortable, familiar fear. It was something the men could understand. "The platform is utilizing a radar-absorbing metamaterial and some kind of kinetic repulsor technology," Harlan continued, lying with such absolute conviction that I almost believed him. "It is an unacceptable threat to national security. High Command has authorized a direct, proportional response. We are going to clear the hazard." The engineering chief raised his hand cautiously. "Major, with all due respect, we don't have anti-satellite weaponry at Station 0. We have weather rockets. We have Payload 2, Harlan corrected, his eyes gleaming with a dark, obsessive light, "which arrived on the last transport plane under a black manifest. It is currently sitting in Deep Storage Armory Sublevel 3. It is a specialized, high-yield kinetic penetrator, a solid tungsten carbide rod, tipped with a shaped high-explosive charge. It was designed to bust subterranean bunkers, but SAC believes if we mount it to our heavy-lift sounding rocket, it will have enough kinetic energy to shatter the Soviet platform." My stomach plummeted. Harlan wasn't trying to clear a satellite. He'd told SAC exactly what we hit. And whoever was pulling the strings back in Washington had decided that the appropriate response to discovering an impossible, invisible barrier enclosing the Earth was to try and blow a hole in it. The sheer staggering hubris of it was breathtaking. "We begin launch preparations immediately," Harlan ordered. "The engineering team will mate the penetrator to the booster. Sergeant Vance, you will recalibrate the primary radar to track the high-density mass of the tungsten rod. We launch in 48 hours. The next 2 days were a blur of exhausting, terrified labor. The base was operating at a fever pitch. The engineers dragged the massive, matte black penetrator out of the deep storage vault, using heavy chains and a hydraulic lift to hoist it to the surface. It didn't look like a scientific instrument. It looked like a spear meant for a god. I spent hours at my console, adjusting the sweep frequencies, trying to ignore the ever-present hum. Elias was nowhere to be seen. He'd barricaded himself in his office, refusing to eat or speak to anyone. When the launch window finally arrived, the weather outside was biblical. The surface temperature had plummeted to 70 below zero. But the sky wasn't dark. A massive, unprecedented geomagnetic storm was hammering the upper atmosphere. The aurora borealis had ignited across the entire horizon, but it wasn't the usual gentle curtains of green. It was a violent, chaotic storm of searing violet, crimson, and blinding white light, thrashing across the sky like a wounded animal. I was strapped into my chair in the bunker, the sweat cold on my neck. Harlan was pacing behind me, a radio handset gripped tightly in his fist. "Target coordinates locked," I reported. "Radar is tracking the penetrator mass. Telemetry is green." "Initiate countdown," Harlan ordered. 10, 9, 8. I could hear the men in the bunker holding their breath. 3, 2, 1. Ignition. The rumble this time was noticeably heavier. The heavy lift booster tore itself off the pad, fighting gravity with millions of pounds of thrust. The green blip on my screen surged upward. "Mach 2, I called out. "Mach 3. Trajectory is nominal. Passing 50 miles. "Mach 4. Entering the mesosphere. 60 miles. "Mach 5. Payload separation confirmed. The penetrator is flying free." "Keep it centered, Sergeant," Harlan hissed, leaning over my shoulder. 70 miles, I said, my voice tightening. Approaching 73 miles. Impact in 3, 2. The radar screen didn't just flare this time. It completely whited out. A blinding flash of phosphor illuminated the entire bunker, followed instantly by an acoustic shockwave so violent that the reinforced glass on the observation blister above us audibly cracked. The external microphones simply blew out, the audio feed dissolving into a deafening, high-pitched squeal of dying electronics. The low-frequency hum that had been plaguing the base vanished. It didn't fade. It was instantly replaced by a sound I will never forget as long as I live. It was the sound of a glacier tearing itself apart, amplified 1,000 times over. A deafening, agonizing shriek of structural failure. "Status," Harlan roared, slapping the side of my monitor. "Did we breach the target? Did the explosive charge detonate?" "I don't know," I yelled back, my hands flying across the dials. "Radar is completely blind!" "The electromagnetic interference is off the charts." "I want visual," Harlan barked, turning to the security detail. "Get the blast doors open. Get to the observation deck now." Protocol dictated that we stay strapped in, but the sheer primal terror of that sound pulled us out of our chairs. Harlan, the engineering chief, and I sprinted out of the radar room, pounding up the concrete stairwell toward the surface observation blister. The heavy steel blast doors had been unsealed by the guards, who were standing there looking up at the reinforced plexiglass dome that looked out over the launch pad. We crowded into the blister, our breath pluming in the freezing air. We looked up into the polar night. The rocket was gone, but the sky was not. The violent, chaotic storm of the aurora borealis had stopped moving. The ribbons of crimson and violet light were no longer drifting. They were pooling. The light was collecting and intensifying against an invisible ceiling, illuminating the barrier from below. And then, right before our eyes, the sky reacted. It started at the exact point of impact, directly above the launch pad. A blindingly bright, jagged line of white light snapped across the heavens. It sounded like a whip cracking inside my own skull. Then another line shot out. And another. We stood there, paralyzed in the freezing observation blister, watching as a massive, glowing spiderweb of stress fractures tore its way across the upper atmosphere. The cracks spread for hundreds of miles in every direction, deep, luminous fissures suspended in the empty space between the stars. The aurora bled into the cracks, highlighting a geometry of shattered glass, so vast it defied human comprehension. Harlan dropped his radio handset. It clattered against the steel floor grate. He didn't say a word about Soviet satellites. He just stared up at the broken roof of the world. The sky had shattered, and the fractures were holding their shape against the dark. We stood there for I don't know how long. Time simply ceased to function in that freezing observation blister. The bitter air bleeding through the cracked plexiglass should have driven us back down the concrete stairwell within seconds. But nobody moved. We just stared up at the impossible geometry etched into the thermosphere. The glowing fault lines stretched across the heavens, a web of blinding white and bleeding violet light that made the distant stars behind it look like cheap, painted props on a stage. It was the most terrifyingly beautiful thing I'd ever seen, and every survival instinct I possessed was screaming at me to look away, to hide, to bury myself as deep in the ice as I could get. Major Harlan was the first to break the silence. He didn't issue an order. He just let out a low, ragged breath that sounded like a death rattle. He bent down, picked up his dropped radio handset with trembling fingers, and stared at the plastic casing like he'd forgotten what it was for. The engineering chief, a grizzled, 20-year veteran who'd survived the frozen hell of the Chosin Reservoir in Korea, was weeping silently beside me. The tears were freezing in the deep lines of his face before they even reached his jaw. "What did we do?" the chief kept whispering. "Major, what did we do?" That question seemed to snap Harlan out of his paralysis. The military programming rebooted, overriding the existential shock with sheer, aggressive protocol. "Get back below," Harlan roared, suddenly shoving the engineering chief toward the heavy steel door. "Everyone back in the bunker. Seal the blast doors. Move." We scrambled down the concrete stairwell, our boots ringing out like gunshots. The heavy steel door slammed shut above us, the locking wheel spinning with a harsh metallic screech, sealing us in. But sealing the doors didn't keep the nightmare out. It just locked us inside the drum. The moment the tungsten penetrator had struck the barrier, the low-frequency hum that had plagued the base for days had vanished, replaced by that horrific tearing sound. But as we reached the bottom of the stairwell and stepped back into the main subterranean corridor, I realized the hum was back. And it was angry. Before, the vibration had been a nuisance. Now, it was a physical assault. The reinforced concrete walls were actively trembling. Dust and loose mortar rained down continuously from the ceiling fixtures. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered and buzzed, struggling to maintain a steady arc. You couldn't even walk in a straight line. The steel floor plates vibrated so intensely that your boots felt like they were slipping on oiled glass. The panic spreading through Station Zero wasn't loud. It wasn't a riot. It was a quiet, suffocating terror. As I made my way back toward the radar bunker, I saw men sitting on their bunks in the open barracks, staring blankly at the walls, their hands pressed hard over their ears. The base medic was completely overwhelmed. He'd set up a triage station in the mess hall and was treating half a dozen men for severe nosebleeds, spontaneous heavy bleeding caused by the extreme acoustic pressure changes. Bright red blood was spotting the pristine white tiles of the floor. Harlan didn't go to the infirmary. He didn't use the intercom to address the men or try to calm the rising panic. He marched straight into the primary command center, his boots crunching on the fallen mortar, and went directly for the red encrypted phone on the far wall. He snatched the receiver off the cradle, slammed it against his ear, and waited. I watched him from the doorway of the radar room. He stood there for 5 full minutes, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the plastic handset. But he never spoke. He never authenticated his call sign. The line was dead. The massive bloom of electromagnetic interference pouring out of the shattered barrier had completely severed our only tether to the outside world. Harlan slowly lowered the receiver back onto the cradle. He stood facing the concrete wall for a long moment, his shoulders rising and falling with heavy, jagged breaths. When he finally turned to face me, his eyes were dead. "Sergeant Vance," Harlan said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm monotone. "Get on your console." I swallowed hard. tasting the metallic tang of copper in the back of my throat. Sir, the primary array is saturated with static. The electromagnetic interference from the fracture is blinding the receivers. I can't track anything in that clutter. I don't care about the interference, Sergeant, Harlan suddenly bellowed. I don't care about the weather. And I don't care about the static. You will recalibrate the deep space tracking array. You will bypass the standard ionospheric filters, and you will point the main dish directly at the center of that fracture. I want to know exactly what is on the other side of that anomaly. Execute. You don't just point a deep space radar array like a flashlight. It's a highly sensitive, incredibly complex piece of machinery. It requires calculating rotational azimuth, adjusting the gain to filter out background radiation, widening the pulse repetition frequency to look past the immediate atmospheric clutter. I sat down at my console and strapped myself into the chair. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the heavy calibration dials. The thick glass of the cathode ray tube was vibrating against its metal housing, emitting a high-pitched whine that set my teeth on edge. I routed auxiliary power from the secondary diesel generators, boosting the signal strength to maximum output. I manually bypassed the ionospheric filters, essentially telling the radar computer to ignore anything within the first 100 miles of altitude. I wanted to look deep. I wanted to push the radar beam straight through the glowing cracks in the sky and see what was waiting behind the glass. The screen was a blinding blizzard of white noise for the first 20 minutes. The sheer volume of ambient energy bleeding out of the stress fractures was overwhelming the receiver, painting the scope in a solid block of bright green phosphor. But I kept working the dials, tuning the gain, aggressively filtering out the radiation spikes, narrowing the beam directly into the largest, deepest fissure we'd opened directly above the base. Slowly, agonizingly, the static began to thin out. The sweeping arm of the radar started to leave distinct, solid returns on the glass. But the scale was entirely wrong. In radar telemetry, you get used to reading specific signatures. A long-range bomber has a distinct, lumbering cross-section. An ICBM looks like a fast, sharp needle plunging toward the Earth. A satellite is a tiny, consistent dot, moving in a predictable orbital path. The returns I was getting now didn't make any mathematical sense. At first, I thought it was a catastrophic hardware malfunction. I thought the radar signal was bouncing back off the inside of the dome, returning a distorted, magnified reflection of the Arctic ice shelf below us. But the tracking speed and the Doppler shift confirmed it wasn't a ground clutter reflection. The objects were moving, and they were outside the barrier. "Major," I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak over the grinding hum of the bunker. Harlan stepped up behind me, gripping the back of my metal chair so tightly I could hear his joints popping. "Do you have a clear picture, Sergeant? Are you tracking the Soviet platform?" "I have returned, sir," I said, my mouth completely dry. "But the calibration must be corrupted. The mass readings are impossible." I pointed a trembling finger at the glowing green blobs slowly drifting across the upper left quadrant of the scope. "These returns are registering at an altitude of roughly 400 miles. They are well outside the barrier. But the cross-section... Sir, if this radar is functioning accurately, those objects aren't satellites or orbital weapons. Then what are they, Vance?" Harlan demanded, leaning in so close I could smell the stale sweat and fear radiating off him. "They're the size of continents, sir," I whispered. "The mass readings indicate solid objects thousands of miles across." Harlan stared at the screen. He didn't yell this time. He didn't threaten me with a court-martial or scream about Russian trickery. He just stared at the slow, deliberate movement of those massive, impossible returns. They weren't drifting aimlessly like dead orbital debris. They were moving with horrific, undeniable purpose. They were shifting, reorienting, converging slowly from the edges of the radar's maximum range toward the exact coordinates of the fracture we'd just created. Whatever was out there, it had heard us knocking, and now it was coming to look at the crack in the glass. "Keep tracking them," Harlan whispered, his voice completely hollow. He let go of my chair, turned, and walked out of the radar room. His posture was slumped, his steps dragging. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. I was left alone in the dim green light of the bunker, watching the impossible masses slide across the screen. I sat there for hours, mesmerized and paralyzed by terror, listening to the bass groan and vibrate around me. It must have been near 0300 hours when the heavy steel door to the radar room clicked open and slid shut. I jumped in my chair, my hand instinctively dropping to the heavy metal flashlight on my belt. But it was only Elias. If the civilian physicist had looked bad before the second launch, he looked like a walking corpse now. His clothes were heavily stained with dark developer chemicals and dried sweat. His hands were wrapped in bloody gauze. He didn't say a word as he approached. He just walked up to my console, carrying a thick, water-stained manila envelope. "Elias," I said, keeping my voice low, glancing nervously toward the door. "You shouldn't be up here. The base is still on condition Delta. If Harlan's security detail sees you out of your quarters..." Harlan is sitting in his office with his service pistol resting on his desk. Elias interrupted, his voice dead flat. "He's not coming back out, Vance. He's not going to issue any more orders. He knows. He finally understands what he did." Elias dropped the envelope onto the metal console next to my keyboard. It landed with a heavy, wet slap. "I developed the optical film from the external observation cameras," Elias said, staring blankly at the continent-sized returns drifting across my radar scope. He didn't even seem surprised by them. "I processed the high-speed footage of the second impact, and the long-exposure shots the cameras took automatically in the minutes after the sky cracked. I didn't want to look. Every fiber of my being told me to sweep that envelope onto the floor, turn back to my instruments, and pretend none of this was happening. But the human mind is a cursed, fragile thing. It demands to know the shape of the monster in the dark, even if seeing it will break you." I reached out with trembling fingers and unfastened the metal clasp of the envelope. I pulled out the first photograph. It was a wide-angle shot of the sky directly above the launch pad, taken a few seconds after the tungsten penetrator hit the barrier. The glowing spiderweb of fractures dominated the frame. But Elias hadn't brought the photograph just to show me the cracks. He reached over and tapped the glossy paper. "Look at the illumination," Elias said, leaning over my shoulder, his breath hot and ragged against my neck. Before the strike, the aurora borealis was entirely contained below the barrier. It was an atmospheric phenomenon. The light reflected off the inside of the dome, washing out the stars. But look at the deepest fissures now. Look at the epicenter of the impact. I squinted at the photograph. The blinding white light of the fracture wasn't just glowing on the surface of the glass. It was bleeding through the cracks. But it wasn't bleeding out into the endless, empty vacuum of space. The light was being cast against something else, something hovering just on the other side of the barrier, absorbing the illumination. "The barrier isn't just a physical wall, Vance," Elias whispered. "It's a mirror, a two-way mirror. When you shine a flashlight against a window from inside a dark room, you can't see what's outside in the night. All you see is the reflection of the room you're standing in. The aurora, the sunlight reflecting off the ice cap. It's been blinding us, keeping us from seeing out. But the penetrator broke the silvering. It let the light through." He reached out with a bandaged hand and pulled the first photograph away, revealing the second one underneath. This one was different. It was a highly magnified long exposure shot of the central fracture. taken by the tracking camera about 20 minutes after the strike. The violent energy of the aurora had dimmed slightly in that specific sector, reducing the glare against the invisible glass. "I pushed the chemical contrast to the absolute limit," Elias said, his voice trembling so badly he could barely force the words out. "I burned the silver halide negative until the film almost caught fire in the darkroom. I needed to see what the light from the cracks was hitting on the other side. I looked down at the photograph. The jagged, glowing lines of the shattered sky were stark and bright, cutting across the frame, but pressed directly against the other side of the fracture, blotting out the distant stars and absorbing the bleeding light of the aurora, was a shadow. It wasn't the angular hull of a Soviet satellite. It wasn't a floating piece of orbital debris. It was a distinct organic shape. It was shifting, pressing its immense weight against the stress fractures, trying to look down through the cracks in the glass. The continent-sized masses registering on my radar screen weren't ships. They weren't asteroids. I traced the dark, curved outline of the shadow on the photograph, my blood turning to ice. The geometry was unmistakable. It was a massive, incomprehensible eye, the pupil wider than a mountain range, peering down through the broken roof of our cage, looking directly at us. I shoved the photograph back across the metal console, my hand trembling so violently that I knocked my half-empty coffee mug onto the floor. The heavy ceramic shattered against the steel floor plates, the sharp crack cutting through the relentless hum of the bunker. I didn't even look down. I couldn't take my eyes off the manila envelope. You try to rationalize it. You try to build a mental firewall. I told myself it was a trick of the chemical developer, a double exposure anomaly. But I knew how high-speed tracking cameras worked. That shadow wasn't an artifact. It was a physical mass pressing against the other side of the invisible glass, and it possessed an anatomical structure. A pupil, an iris, a curvature that implied a biological scale so massive it defied the fundamental laws of physics. Elias didn't flinch when the mug shattered. He didn't blink. He just slowly slid the photograph back into the envelope and fastened the metal clasp with agonizing precision. He looked at me, and whatever spark of frantic, obsessive scientific curiosity that had been driving him for the past week was entirely gone. His eyes were flat, dull, and utterly defeated. "They aren't satellites, Vance," Elias whispered. "They aren't Soviet interceptors. They're the observers. We've been living in a terrarium for thousands of years, and we just threw a rock at the glass. Now the owners are coming over to inspect the crack." He turned and walked out of the radar room, leaving me alone with the sweeping green arm of the deep space array, which was still painting the slow, deliberate approach of those continent-sized masses. I didn't report the photograph to Major Harlan. I didn't log it. I just sat there, listening to the bass groan and vibrate around me, feeling a cold, suffocating dread settle into the marrow of my bones. The next 72 hours blurred into a continuous, waking nightmare. Condition Delta remained in absolute effect, but Harlan didn't need the armed air police to keep the men inside anymore. The psychological collapse of Station Zero happened with terrifying speed. In the military, you're trained to handle being pinned down. You learn to deal with claustrophobia. But this was an entirely different breed of terror. The men weren't afraid of the dark tunnels or the cramped concrete barracks. They were terrified of the open space above them. The realization that the infinite sky was actually a sealed roof, and that something unimaginably heavy was moving across it, broke them. Nobody wanted to go near the surface access stairwells. The men assigned to routine maintenance on the external generator vents outright refused their orders, risking court-martial rather than stepping out from under the reinforced concrete. I watched grown men, hardened veterans, sitting on their bunks with their blankets pulled over their heads, weeping silently into their knees. The copper smell was the worst part, because it came from the blood. The low-frequency hum had escalated from a vibration into a crushing atmospheric pressure. It felt like standing at the bottom of a deep swimming pool. The base medic had essentially abandoned the infirmary and moved his medical supplies into the center of the mess hall, where the structural supports were thickest. He was working around the clock, treating a constant stream of casualties. Men were suffering from severe, spontaneous nosebleeds. Others reported agonizing migraines that blurred their vision. 2 of the engineers had cracked their own molars from clenching their jaws so hard against the relentless vibration, and the base itself was failing. Hairline fractures began to appear in the concrete walls of the main corridors. Fine, powdery mortar dusted our shoulders as we walked. The overhead fluorescent tubes flickered constantly. The heavy steel pipes of the HVAC system rattled and clanged, sounding like someone was methodically striking them with a sledgehammer. I kept to my console in the radar room. It was the only place I felt any semblance of control. But on the morning of the 4th day after the penetrator strike, the wired intercom on my desk buzzed to life. "Sergeant Vance," Major Harlan's voice crackled through the speaker. "Report to the primary command center immediately." I locked down my console and made my way through the dusty, trembling corridors. When I pushed open the heavy door to the command hub, the room was empty except for Harlan. He had dismissed the communications officers and the security detail. He was standing alone by the encrypted teletype machine, staring at a long ribbon of punched paper that had spooled out onto the floor. He didn't look up as I entered. He just pointed at the paper. "The electromagnetic interference finally broke for a window of about 4 minutes, Harlan said quietly. "Just long enough for the automated relays at Strategic Air Command to push through a prioritized flash message." "Read it, Sergeant." I walked over, the floor plates vibrating beneath my boots, and picked up the end of the paper strip. I translated the punched code in my head. Directive 7 Alpha. Station 0. Classification, absolute. Situation assessment, critical biological hazard. Orders, immediate medical quarantine protocol initiated. No extraction flights authorized. No supply drops authorized. All radar and telemetry arrays must be powered down immediately. Cease all optical tracking. Seal all surface access points. Do not look at the sky. Await further instructions. End message. I read the message 3 times, my mind struggling to process the sheer, calculated coldness of it. They weren't sending reinforcements. They weren't sending scientists. They had declared us a biological hazard. "A medical quarantine," I whispered, dropping the paper. "Major, nobody here is sick. It's the acoustic pressure from the barrier. It's the hum causing the bleeding." "They know that, Vance," Harlan said, turning to face me. The bags under his eyes were so dark they looked like bruises. "They don't think we have a virus. The quarantine is a containment protocol, for information. They are sealing the box. We are being erased. They can't just leave 40 men to die on the ice," I argued, though the sinking feeling in my gut told me they absolutely could. Harlan let out a short, bitter laugh that sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. "An orbital threat. God, I was so stupid. Do you want to know the truth, Sergeant? The real reason I ordered that second launch?" He walked over to his desk and slumped into his heavy leather chair. He looked at his service pistol, which was sitting squarely in the center of the blotter, fully loaded. "I received a secure phone call from a 4-star general at SAC 2 hours before we launched the penetrator," Harlan confessed. "He didn't ask me for my assessment. He didn't ask for the telemetry data. He just told me that Payload 1 had successfully identified the upper boundary, and that I was authorized to test the structural limits of that boundary with the tungsten rod." I stared at him, my mind flashing back to Elias and his frantic ravings about the ice core samples. They already knew, I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. Command knew the dome was there. Of course they knew, Harlan whispered, rubbing his face with his trembling hands. Why do you think they built a multi-million-dollar deep space radar facility in the middle of a frozen wasteland? Why do you think they assigned an atmospheric physicist to study ancient ice core samples? The geological records showed the microtectites, the shedding glass. They knew something was up there, stopping the meteorites. They've known since the late 50s, when the first high-altitude nuclear tests bounced their own electromagnetic pulses back down to Earth in ways that defied orbital mechanics. Harlan looked up at me, his eyes shining with a mixture of profound guilt and absolute terror. We weren't a research station, Vance. We were a probe, a stick poking a hornet's nest. High Command wanted to know exactly how thick the glass was, and they wanted to know what would happen if we cracked it. Well, we cracked it. And whatever is looking down through that crack terrified them so badly that they just crossed our coordinates off the map. We are dead men, Sergeant. We just haven't stopped breathing yet. Before I could respond, the heavy door to the command center slammed open. It was Elias. He had completely unspooled. He had a heavy steel wrench gripped in his right hand, and his eyes were wide, manic. He marched straight past me, heading directly for the restricted communications suite at the back of the command hub. "Elias, halt!" Harlan barked, surging out of his chair, his hand dropping instinctively toward the pistol on his desk. "They aren't going to bury this," Elias screamed. He swung the wrench, smashing the glass covering the emergency fire alarm panel. "I have the telemetry. I have the photographs. I'm going to hotwire the long-range transmitter. I'm going to bypass the encryption modules and broadcast the optical feed on every civilian shortwave frequency I can reach. The whole world needs to know we're in a cage." He lunged for the door of the comm suite. Harlan didn't hesitate. He vaulted over the desk and tackled Elias to the concrete floor. It wasn't a clean takedown. It was a desperate, ugly struggle. Elias thrashed wildly, swinging the heavy wrench, catching Harlan a glancing blow on the shoulder. Harlan grunted in pain, but managed to pin Elias's arm beneath his knee. He drove his fist into Elias's jaw, a sickening wet crack that snapped the physicist's head back against the floor plates. Elias went limp. Harlan stood up, chest heaving, his uniform smeared with Elias's blood and the ever-present concrete dust. He looked down at the unconscious civilian, then looked at me. "Help me get him to the brig," Harlan ordered, his voice trembling. "Secure him in a holding cell. He's a threat to operational security." "Major," I said softly, "operational security doesn't exist anymore. You just said it yourself. We're dead." "We are still military personnel," Harlan suddenly roared. "We still follow orders. The directive said quarantine. The directive said power down the arrays. We will follow the directive until the ice takes us. Now help me carry him." I didn't argue. I grabbed Elias by the shoulders. Harlan took his legs, and we dragged the unconscious physicist down the corridor to the security block. We locked him inside a reinforced holding cell. As the heavy steel door slammed shut, I could see Elias beginning to stir. I knew he wouldn't stop. He was trapped in a cage within a cage, and his mind had already fractured right alongside the sky. "Go back to the radar room, Sergeant," Harlan told me, leaning heavily against the steel door of the brig. "Execute the directive. Power down the scopes. Cut the feed to the tracking arrays." We stopped looking. I left Harlan standing there in the dark and walked back to my bunker. The radar room was suffocatingly hot. I sat down at my console, The green phosphor screen was still sweeping. The massive, continent-sized returns had stopped converging. They were now holding position, hovering directly over the coordinates of Station 0. They had found the crack. I reached out and grasped the heavy main power breaker for the deep space array. My hand hesitated. Turning this switch meant blinding ourselves. It meant sitting in the dark, waiting for the boot to drop. But I was a soldier. I pulled the heavy lever down. The deep hum of the radar's cooling fans spun down into silence. The green glow of the cathode ray tubes collapsed into a single, bright dot in the center of the glass, and then faded to black. The room was plunged into shadows. I sat there in the dark for what felt like hours. Without the visual confirmation of the radar, my mind began to play tricks on me. I started to imagine the sheer weight of those entities pressing against the invisible glass. Then, the acoustic pressure changed. The relentless, grinding hum shifted. The pitch dropped even lower, moving from a mechanical thrum into something that felt distinctly organic. It felt like a heartbeat, a slow, rhythmic, impossibly deep pulsation. And then, the automated proximity alarms began to scream. These weren't the radar alarms. I'd killed the radar. These were the localized, surface-level barometric and optical alarms. I scrambled out of my chair and lunged toward the optical monitoring station. Elias had left the closed-circuit television feeds running. I slapped the power switch on the bank of small black and white monitors. The screens flickered to life. There was no aurora borealis visible anymore. The violent light storm had either burned itself out, or it was being blocked. The cameras were looking up into a clear, freezing polar night. I stared at the monitors, trying to understand what had triggered the proximity alarms. The motion sensors were screaming that something was moving directly over the base. But the screens just showed the black sky and the stars. I leaned closer to the glass, wiping a thin layer of condensation away with my sleeve. I watched the stars. They weren't twinkling. They were disappearing. Slowly, methodically, vast patches of the starry sky were simply blinking out. A massive, absolute blackness was sliding across the field of view, eclipsing the distant light of the cosmos. It wasn't a cloud. This was a solid, perfect void. It was moving with deliberate, terrifying silence, sliding across the invisible ceiling directly above our heads. The proximity alarms weren't malfunctioning. The barometric sensors on the surface were registering a massive, sudden change in atmospheric pressure. Whatever was on the other side of the glass was pressing down so hard that the invisible barrier was actually bowing inward. The shadows weren't just looking anymore. They were gathering. They were pressing their weight against the fractured glass directly over Station 0, and the alarms were screaming because the sky itself was slowly, inexorably coming down. I watched the stars disappear. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, agonizing erasure of the cosmos. On the small black and white security monitors, the absolute blackness slid across the field of view, with the unstoppable momentum of a tectonic plate. It was a physical mass, an entity of such incomprehensible scale that its mere presence was altering the atmospheric pressure of the entire Arctic Circle. Whatever was on the other side of the barrier was pressing its weight against the glass directly above Station 0. The invisible dome was bowing inward. You could feel it in your teeth. You could feel it in the fluid of your eyes. The air pressure inside the radar bunker spiked so violently that my eardrums popped. I reached up, my fingers coming away slick with bright red blood. The low-frequency hum had evolved into a deep, rhythmic thrumming, a heartbeat that vibrated the heavy steel floor plates so hard, my boots were chattering against the metal. Above me, the reinforced concrete ceiling of the bunker began to groan. It was the sound of thousands of tons of earth and stone being pushed to the absolute limit of their tensile strength. Fine, powdery concrete dust rained down on my shoulders. I couldn't move. My military training, the drills, the survival instincts, they all evaporated in the face of something that rendered humanity entirely irrelevant. I just stood there, bleeding from my ears and nose, watching the monitor as the last visible star was swallowed by the shifting shadow of the observer. And then, just as the structural steel beams of the bunker began to shriek under the bending atmospheric pressure, the whiteout hit. It didn't roll in like a normal Arctic storm. It detonated. 1 second. The external cameras were showing the suffocating black void of the entity pressing against the sky. The next second, every single monitor in the bank blew out simultaneously. A massive, unnatural electromagnetic surge slammed into Station 0. The secondary diesel generators simply died. The bunker was plunged into absolute, crushing darkness. The silence that followed the generator failure lasted for exactly 1 heartbeat. Then, the wind struck the surface. Even buried under 10 feet of permafrost and reinforced concrete, the roar of the storm was deafening. The temperature inside the bunker began to plummet immediately. I fumbled in the dark, my hands shaking violently, until I found the heavy brass flashlight on my belt. I flicked it on. The beam cut through the thick concrete dust hanging in the air. I drew my parka tight around my neck, grabbed the heavy handle of the radar room door, and forced it open. The main corridor was a scene of absolute chaos. The emergency chemical lights had been cracked, casting a sickly, dim red glow over the panicked men. The temperature was dropping so fast, I could see my own breath pluming in the red light. "Get to the mess hall." I found myself screaming, my voice tearing at my throat. "Get to the center of the base! Move!" It took 20 minutes to corral the 40 men of our detachment into that room. We dragged the heavy metal tables against the walls and huddled in the center of the floor, wrapping ourselves in sleeping bags, survival blankets, and whatever insulated gear we had managed to pull from the lockers. And there we sat. For 4 days, I cannot adequately describe the psychological torture of those 96 hours. The whiteout storm raging on the surface never lessened in intensity. The temperature inside the mess hall dropped to 5 degrees below zero. We huddled together for body heat, a tangled mass of shivering, terrified men, eating frozen MRE rations that chipped our teeth. But the cold wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the sounds coming from the brig. Elias was locked in a reinforced holding cell at the far end of the corridor. For the first 2 days, Elias screamed. He didn't scream for help. He screamed about the glass. His voice echoed down the concrete pipes, distorted and hollow. "They're fixing it," he shrieked, over and over again. "They're melting the sand. They're pouring it over the cracks. Don't you hear it? They're sealing the terrarium." His frantic ravings infected the men. Major Harlan sat in the corner of the room, entirely catatonic. He still had his unloaded service pistol gripped in his hand. He hadn't spoken a word since the power failed. By the 3rd day, Elias stopped screaming. The silence from his cell was somehow worse than the screaming. We waited for the ceiling to collapse. We waited for the massive, continent-sized shadow to press down hard enough to shatter the dome and crush us all beneath millions of tons of falling atmospheric glass. But the end didn't come. On the morning of the 4th day, the shrieking wind abruptly died. It didn't fade away gradually. It stopped with the suddenness of a closing door. The relentless, crushing barometric pressure lifted. The low-frequency hum was gone. The silence in the mess hall was absolute. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up from the floor. My joints popped, stiff from the bitter cold. I clicked on my flashlight. The batteries were dying, the beam a weak, jaundiced yellow. I walked toward the heavy steel door of the mess hall. "Sergeant," The engineering chief whispered from the floor, his voice raspy. "Where are you going?" "To see if we're still buried," I replied. I walked out into the dark corridor. The base was entirely lifeless. I made my way past the frozen, silent doors of the barracks and approached the concrete stairwell leading up to the surface observation blister. The heavy blast doors at the top of the stairs were coated in a thick layer of rime ice. I had to use a heavy steel pry bar from the emergency fire locker to break the frozen seal. When I finally threw my weight against the door, it swung outward with a sharp crack of breaking ice. I stepped up into the observation blister. The plexiglass dome was entirely covered in a thick layer of packed snow. I took the sleeve of my heavy parka and began scrubbing frantically at the glass, clearing a small porthole. I pressed my face against the freezing plexiglass and looked up. I expected to see the massive, dark eye of the observer. I expected to see the jagged, glowing spiderweb of stress fractures, bleeding the light of the aurora into the void. I expected to see the end of everything. I saw nothing. The sky was perfectly, flawlessly clear. It was the deep, velvety black of the polar night, dusted with the cold, hard light of a billion distant stars. There was no aurora, there were no cracks, there was no shadow. The heavens looked exactly as they had looked for thousands of years. Vast, empty, infinite. The cognitive dissonance hit me so hard I actually stumbled backward. I looked up again. It was perfect. It was too perfect. Elias was right. The storm hadn't been a weather event. It had been a curtain. They had thrown a sheet over the cage while they repaired the damage. They had melted the microtectites, smoothed over the tungsten impact crater, and resealed the glass. The terrarium was intact. The illusion of infinite space had been restored. I slid down the wall of the observation blister and sat on the freezing floor, burying my face in my hands. I didn't feel relief. I felt a profound, bottomless despair. We had touched the edge of the universe, and it had pushed us back down into the dirt. 4 hours later, the vibration of heavy engines penetrated the ice. 3 massive, ski-equipped C-130 Hercules transport planes were touching down on the ice shelf. They were entirely unmarked. No tail numbers. No Air Force insignias. Just flat, matte gray paint. Before the propellers even stopped spinning, the rear cargo ramps dropped. Dozens of men poured out onto the ice. They weren't medics. They weren't a rescue team. They were heavily armed, wearing stark white cold-weather gear with no unit patches, carrying M14 battle rifles. I walked back down the stairs and met them at the primary airlock. They didn't ask if we were okay. A man wearing a heavy parka with a captain's bars pinned to the collar stepped into the corridor, flanked by 4 armed men. He looked at me with eyes as cold and dead as the ice outside. "Sergeant Vance?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I managed to croak. "Assemble the surviving personnel in the main hangar bay. You have 10 minutes. The erasure of Station Zero was methodical, brutal, and absolute. I watched as men with acetylene torches cut the hinges off the heavy iron safes in Harlan's office. They dragged filing cabinets full of telemetry strip charts out onto the ice and dropped thermite grenades into them, reducing months of data to blinding white slag. They went into the radar bunker and used heavy sledgehammers to physically smash the cathode ray tubes and the internal hard drives of the tracking computers. They stripped Elias's darkroom down to the bare concrete, confiscating every single strip of silver halide negative, every photograph. They found Elias in the brig. He was alive, but just barely. The cold had taken 3 of his fingers, and his mind was completely gone. He didn't fight them as they strapped him into a canvas straitjacket and dragged him up the stairs. He just kept mumbling about the glass, his eyes rolling aimlessly in his skull. When they came for Major Harlan, He didn't resist either. They marched him out onto the ice and loaded him into the back of the second transport plane, isolated from the rest of us. We were lined up, stripped of our winter gear, and injected with a heavy chemical sedative. My vision blurred, my knees buckled, and the last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the smell of burning thermite and the sight of the unmarked planes waiting on the ice. I woke up 3 days later in a windowless, cinderblock room that smelled of industrial bleach and stale cigarette smoke. I was sitting at a metal table. Across from me sat 2 men in immaculate, dark civilian suits. They didn't introduce themselves. They slid a thick, single-spaced document across the table, a non-disclosure agreement. Sergeant Vance, the older of the 2 men, said, his voice perfectly modulated, devoid of any threat but dripping with absolute authority. You and your detachment were the victims of an experimental, localized Soviet electromagnetic warfare test. The extreme low-frequency radiation caused severe neurological distress, auditory hallucinations, and mass hysteria. The sounding rockets you launched experienced catastrophic mid-air detonations due to this interference. This is the official assessment of the Department of Defense. You will memorize this assessment. You will internalize it. If you ever speak a word to the contrary, to your family, to a priest, or to a journalist, you will disappear into a federal penitentiary so deep, you will forget what the sky looks like. He handed me a black pen. Sign the document, Sergeant, or we keep you in the dark forever. I looked at the pen. I thought about the eye looking down through the cracks in the sky. I thought about the sheer, overwhelming power of the institution sitting across from me. I signed my name. I wanted to see the sun again, even if I knew it was just a heat lamp hanging in a cage. They discharged me from the Air Force 2 weeks later, with a full pension and a medical classification of severe combat fatigue. I took the money, bought a small piece of land in the desert where the sky is always clear, and I tried to forget. But you don't forget something like that. Every time I look up at the stars, I don't see infinite space. I see the painted ceiling of a waiting room. The men of Station Zero didn't fare well. The engineering chief shot himself in his garage 3 years after we got back. Corporal Miller turned to heroin and vanished into the streets of Houston. Major Harlan drank himself to death in a cheap motel in Barstow in the winter of 1983. The police report said his liver just gave out. But I knew a guy who knew the responding officer. He told me that Harlan had spent his last days taping aluminum foil over the windows of his motel room, screaming at the ceiling, begging whoever was up there to stop looking at him. And Elias. I only saw Elias one more time. It was the late 90s. I tracked him down to a secure, state-run psychiatric facility in upstate New York. The government had buried him deep in the ward, officially classified as a ward of the state, with severe, untreatable schizophrenia. I bribed an orderly to let me look through the reinforced glass of his cell door. Elias was an old man, his hair pure white, his body frail and wasted. He was sitting on the floor, holding a piece of black charcoal he'd scavenged from somewhere. He didn't know his own name. He didn't recognize my face through the glass, but he was still working. The padded walls of his cell were entirely covered in frantic, overlapping drawings. Hundreds, thousands of jagged, interconnected lines radiating outward from central impact points. He was drawing spider webs, over and over and over again, trying to show the world the cracks in the sky. I walked away before he could look up and see me crying. Decades passed. The Cold War ended. The world moved on. A few years ago, when the Freedom of Information Act began forcing the government to declassify thousands of old, black-budget documents from the 60s, I hired a lawyer. We spent 2 years filing blind requests. The Department of Defense fought us every step of the way, claiming the records had been destroyed in a fire. But bureaucracies are massive, lumbering beasts, and they always leave a paper trail. Eventually, a single, heavily redacted document slipped through the cracks. It wasn't a mission report. It wasn't telemetry data. It was a simple, mundane logistics inventory list from the final quarter of 1962, detailing the equipment written off as unrecoverable during the closure of Station Zero. The paper was mostly covered in thick bands of black marker. They had redacted the names, the coordinates, and the radar specs. But at the very bottom of the second page, listed under unrecoverable ordnance, was a single line of text that the censor had missed. Item 44, Payload 4, Tungsten Carbide Penetrator. Status, unrecoverable. Embedded in ceiling. Left in place. I keep that piece of paper framed on my wall. It is the only physical proof I have that I am not insane. They changed the payload designation to hide the launch sequence, but the truth is right there in black and white ink, embedded in ceiling. The military officially acknowledged, in their own internal logistics ledger, that the sky has a roof, and that we left a spear stuck in it. I'm an old man now. My lungs are failing, my hands shake, and I don't have many years left. I don't fear death anymore. In a way, I welcome it. It's the only real way out of the terrarium. But sometimes, when the desert night is perfectly still, and the stars are shining with that cold, hard light, I sit on my porch and I look up. I think about that massive, solid tungsten rod, buried deep in the invisible glass, 73 miles above our heads. I think about the immense, continent-sized shadows that drifted across my radar screen. I think about the eye looking down through the cracks. The military thought they solved the problem by erasing the base and silencing the men. They thought that if they just ignored the cracks, the owners of the cage would lose interest and walk away. But glass under pressure doesn't heal. It weakens. Every time a meteor strikes the upper atmosphere, every time a massive solar flare hammers the magnetic field, the stress fractures we created must groan and shift. I look up at the dark, and I wonder how long it's going to take. I wonder how many more years we have before the weight of whatever is walking around on the outside finally becomes too much. I wonder what it's going to sound like when the sky finally shatters and all the glass comes falling down.